All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 4th, 1976. Listeners, let's spend some time on the very weird saga of Gerald Ford's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz. This day, October 4th, was the day that Butz resigned his post after reports of some racist comments that he'd made while on an airline flight back from the Republican National Convention earlier that year. Those comments finally came to light. It became a scandal. He had to resign. The comments were made in front of, now check out this list of people who were on this flight who overheard these comments. Pat Boone, singer Pat Boone, Sonny Bono, TV star singer Sonny Bono, and former White House counsel John Dean. This is not the start of one of those bad jokes. Pat Boone, Sonny Bono, and former White House counsel John Dean walk into a bar. But this is what's on this airplane is this collection of people. And Butz makes this racist joke, which then makes its way to the press, becomes a scandal, and as we're saying, he has to resign. There are so many amazing details in this story. It is a quintessentially, for better and mostly for worse, late 1970s story. Here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I'm fascinated by this story. There's so many great details, but I will just say right off the bat, I feel like my main contribution to this episode is just going to say Earl Butz as many times as possible.
You're really hitting it hard every time you say it.
I would also like to point out, did you catch that his nickname is Rusty?
No.
He is Earl.
He is
Earl Rusty Butz. My God. We could just end the episode
really
right now,
far.
and I feel like we will have provided enough. Yes. Okay, look. So we have this plane ride. Mm-hmm. Amazing detail number one. It's a commercial flight. I just love that all these powerful people, Sonny Bono, Pat Boone, who are like big stars at the moment, former White House counsel, and then the Secretary of Agriculture are all flying commercial back to California from the Republican National Convention. I think we should start with what Earl Butz actually says. Basically, like, my sense is like, you know, the seatbelt light has gone off. They're all like milling about on the plane. They all realize, oh, look who's on the plane. Sonny's on the plane and John's on the plane. Yeah, so they're all like sitting around and, you know, just yucking it up, and the whiskey's probably flowing. And Butz makes this comment, and I'm going to read it, and then we can talk about, you know, what it is. But basically, he's talking about the Republican Party and whether it can appeal to black voters and so forth. And he says, by all reports, he uses the N-word, and then he says, and this is the quote, he says, "I'll tell you what coloreds want. It's three things. First, a tight," and then he says P-word. I'm not going to say it on this podcast. He says, "a tight P. Second, loose shoes. And third, a warm place to shit." I will use that word. That's all. So this is Butz's joke. His comment is clearly racist, but it is also absurd.
Yeah.
It's nonsensical.
It doesn't make sense at all. It's not funny. Like, and as an African American, I'm looking at the joke and I'm like, I don't get it. I don't
what are the stereotypes? And
I'm like, what are loose shoes? Like, I'm trying to figure out what loose shoes are an implication of. Like, it just, none of it made sense. And I think there's a lot of parts of it that are just egregious. It's also heavily sexist as well. There's a lot that goes into it, but it doesn't make sense. And also, as a response to a legitimate question,
right?
A legitimate question.
We have to talk about this.
Why aren't Black people interested in the Republican Party? Why can't we allure or win more Black people into the Republican Party? We are the party of Lincoln. Does that count for something? And this is the response. So,
which in a way is an answer.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it proves the case. Right. Yes. I'll show you why. Because we're super weirdly racist.
That is exactly why. You
corny racist, right?
Yeah, it's like corny, baroque. Like it just feels like it comes from a place of like, oh, there's like so many levels to your racism that you're pulling out these weird stereotypes about like loose shoes and a warm place to shit. Like, what does that even mean? Not that I'm asking him to be more like excessively racist, but it's just like, what are you talking about here?
You don't want a decoder ring for the racism.
So speaking of that, it is very interesting. We'll talk about how the story gets out. These remarks get out. But once they're out and it's reported in the press, there is a very interesting decoder ring contorting in the press about how to characterize these phrases. So the Wall Street Journal characterized him as saying, African Americans wanted 3 things: comfortable footwear, satisfying sexual relations, and indoor plumbing. So that's how the Wall Street Journal characterizes it. The New York Times reports it as, quote, a warm place for bodily functions, wishes that were listed by Mr. Butz in obscene and scatological terms. One other interesting thing is I think a couple newspapers ran it unaltered, and then some newspapers said, he said these weird and awful things. If you want to know what he said, you can come to our office and we'll show you like the remarks or whatever. But anyway, there's just this very funny and weird sort of going out of their way to sort of characterize this very weird racism that he was displaying.
But really interesting the way that media are doing the work of cleaning it up.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And what that does, because when you read the Wall Street Journal's version of it, you're like, African Americans want indoor plumbing, which is just a world away from what he actually said.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I would love to know how did like Sonny respond to this? Is it kind of like, well, what? Or, or is this like, are you drinking too much? Or, like, this doesn't, none of this, not that alcohol would even be an excuse for that, because I feel like when people are drunk, they really reveal themselves. But he's also known, we should say Butz is known as being an outspoken person. So when he is selected to be Secretary of Agriculture, right? When he's elected to be Secretary of Agriculture, basically, he says, you will have a vigorous spokesperson, and is known for kind of shooting from the hip. And I think there is this sort of folksy thing about this is how we speak, this is how we engage with one another, that kind of gets like thrown into the discussion as an explanation for why this was said. But again, it's still problematic.
Yeah, and Butz, I mean, he is a man of a certain age, not to diminish it, but he just like clearly likes to just run his mouth and be racist and yuck it up with other white men, but he had gotten in trouble a few years earlier, as you were hinting at, by making a joke about the Pope wanting population control, and he did a fake Italian accent talking about the Pope, and then they had to apologize. I have a picture of kind of what kind of dude this was. To this question of how it gets out and how people reacted. Okay, so let's put Sonny Bono off to the side. He's on the plane. He doesn't seem to really stay as part of this story. He's not part of how it leaks, but it's just interesting that Sonny Bono is there. John Dean and Pat Boone are very interesting in that the story does seem to leak because of John Dean. Now, John Dean, for context's sake, was Nixon's former White House counsel who famously turned on Nixon when he saw the sort of Watergate tides turning, and testified and really helped bring the House down on Nixon. And this is a couple years later, it's obviously under Ford, but John Dean my read on this is just in full-on like F it mode now, and he hears these remarks and he just goes and he talks to the press and he says like, can you believe this thing that Butz said on the plane? But I just love that John Dean just seems to just be willing to just like
throw it all out there.
Jody, it's actually better than that, though, because John Dean wasn't there as, like, John Dean, former Nixon official. Yeah. He was reporting on the 1976 Republican convention for Rolling Stone. He was there as a reporter. And actually, Butz's aide, who was on the plane, too, told him as he was walking up to this group, remember, Dean's a reporter now. So it's not that the story leaked.
Wow.
The story got reported by a reporter who wrote it for Rolling Stone, and it becomes, public knowledge.
But a reporter who just 4 years earlier would have been in that conversation and would have kept his lips shut because those were his people, and he was on the inner circle, and now he's on the outer circle, and he's just like, forget it. So he reports it, which is fascinating to me. John Dean keeps popping up, and then Pat Boone. Kind of goes out of his way and says like, so Pat Boone's quote is, "I can't believe that this guy had to quit just for making a bad joke in private."
I can't.
Why couldn't he quit for stealing intellectual property from black musicians?
Can we talk about that? How about that, Pat Boone? I mean, it to me, all of this is just like, again, it kind of goes, again, not to make this small either, but like older white men joking, thinking these things are funny. These are the things that they would say over drinks in private, not wondering why it's such a big deal because they always get passes for other things because this is, the late 70s and everybody's getting passes for all kinds of sexist and racist things. And I think they thought that this was going to be another thing where, oops, my bad. And then they keep doing what they're doing. And it just, it doesn't fall out that way.
Ford initially, calls the remarks highly offensive and says he's going to give him a severe reprimand. But, this just becomes a media story and it goes and goes and goes. And eventually it becomes clear that Butz has to resign. He says, quote, "The use of a bad racial commentary in no way reflects my real attitude." And so as we wrap up, I think, Kellie, you just sort of hinted at it. But, there's so many interesting things here about the way that certain people feel like what's said in private and what's said in public, the words that I use versus the values in my heart, my actions versus how I actually feel can be sort of separated and flow in and out of different sort of levels of balance given the circumstance and so forth. And this is such a sort of classic example of that. Butz would not think of himself as a racist and would think that private remarks are private and you can say certain things in private and they don't necessarily reflect in other ways.
I push back on all this because, Ford says, "I've accepted the resignation of a decent and good man." And I remember as a child, my mom, it's a biblical scripture. It's like, out of the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. So it's this idea that what you say is actually kind of who you are. It's really what you believe. And I think that, we can clean it up as much as we want, but this is who Butz prefers to be in private. Someone who makes racist jokes is someone who he really is publicly as well.
And it's also worth noting he wasn't the last Republican cabinet member to run into this problem. It's in 1983 when James Watt, who is the Secretary of Interior under Reagan, gets fired for racist comments he makes about affirmative action that are offensive to, I believe, Black people, women, Jewish people, and the disabled.
Wow.
He really ran the gamut.
Hitting for the cycle, as they say. Yes.
That's right.
Oh, man.
All right, one final coda, I think evidence of, once a shitheel, always a shitheel. Butz goes on. Many years later, he pleads guilty to charges of tax evasion in the early 1980s. He has a 5-year sentence that is suspended for all but 30 days. But there you go. This, I would say, a fairly ignominious career for Butz there, and I'm okay with that.
Rusty Butz goes to jail.
That brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
So long, Rusty Butz.
This is the price I pay for a gross indiscretion in a private conversation. The use of a bad racial commentary in no way reflects my real attitude.
This has been one of the saddest decisions of my presidency. Earl Butz has been and continues to be a close personal friend and a man who loves his country and all that it represents.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia.